Late fall, 1956. A mother, her name was Dorothy, went to the doctor with the what was just generally termed in those days as women issues. And after being examined and her history, they said, you know, probably, given your age, it's not unusual, it's not unnecessary to suggest something that was being suggested to a lot of women in that particular era, and that is maybe it's just time to have a hysterectomy. And so she went home, talked about it with her husband and their children, and she came back and she told the doctor, she says, I think we were okay with that, but it's so close to the holidays. We got Thanksgiving right around the corner, and then it's just almost immediately followed by, can we wait till January? And he says, I don't see any reason why not. I mean, this is not an emergency. It's not a threat. Yeah, that'll be fine. So she got through the holidays. And come January, she came back to the doctor, and she was prepared to have the procedure of a hysterectomy, the removal of her womb. When the doctor just routinely asked, have you missed any cycles lately? And she said, well, yeah, but that's not unusual for me. That's part of what my problem was my irregularity. And he says, I'll tell you what, let's just be safe. Let's just run a pregnancy test. And they did. And they were surprised. And 9 months later, I was born. We call it a surprise. My brother and sister were 9 and 12 years older than I was. My parents were not expecting it. Some people said, well, I bet that was a surprise. And I love the fact that over the years, my parents began to say, no, it was not a surprise. It was the prize. And they always made me feel as a welcomed child. But I was very close to being swept from the womb in what would have been an unintentional act. And yet, when I look at where our country is today and I see the intentional acts that sweep lives like mine from the womb, it just touches me. And so every January I look forward, whatever church that I'm in, and you are no exception, whatever church I'm in, I look forward to the opportunity to share a message on what is normally set aside as the day of Sanctity of Human Life Sunday, for a message that I simply call All Life is Sacred. But it's about the sacredness of all human life. What I have discovered, are we up? My bad. There we go. What we have discovered is that Sanctity of Human Life is not just about the unborn. It's also about the physically and mentally handicapped and challenged. It's also about the elderly, some facing longer lives of pain and suffering and loneliness. So I would say to you first and foremost, if you are pro-life, you got to learn to love and defend more than just the unborn, because that's more than just that issue. What we have discovered is that there is a philosophy in our world that cuts at odds against the sanctity of human life. It's called the dignity of human life, and I just want you to know that the sanctity of human life is different than the dignity of human life. Dignity seems to be based on a relative scale. It seems to be based on happiness or personal fulfillment, the potential that is there, productivity or usefulness. Dignity seems to be tied to the absence of pain or suffering. Sanctity, folks, is based on the worth of a creation given to it by its creator. Dignity is determined more by man. Sanctity is determined by God. Dignity derives its importance from men who make the decision of what's a dignified life or not. Sanctity derives from the majesty of God. Now, abortion is definitely a focal point, not just today across the nation, but for many, it's always on the front burner. But let's not simply rally a cry without understanding what is at stake. You see, abortion is considered by many to be primarily a political issue, and it's not. There are political sides, and I understand that some political stances are such that it's even a foundational thing for them. But abortion is not a political issue. And when you hear from the pulpit a decry against abortion, it's not the preacher trying to make a political statement, because it's more than just politics. Some see it as primarily a moral issue. But I'll tell you something else. It's more than a moral issue as well. What some people miss the fact of, and I mentioned this briefly in Sunday school this morning, is that abortion is an industry that generates over $1.2 billion a year in revenue for Planned Parenthood alone. So abortion is also an economic issue. And if you have read through the book of Acts, you'll find out that Paul learned real quickly what happens when your preaching interferes with those making money from their sin. When he attacked idol worship in Ephesus, it was the craftsmen who constructed temples for Diana that made statues of that temple that mobbed him and wanted to silence him. You can read the story in Acts 19. We won't look there this morning. It seems when you touch an issue that touches money, people are going to find a way to touch you. But more than political, and more than moral, and more than economic, abortion is a spiritual issue. And if you have your Bibles this morning, I invite you to open them up to the book of Psalms, and 106th Psalm in particular. This psalm deals a great deal, and I won't read the whole thing. I've got some of it highlighted that I want to share with you. But this psalm deals with how Israel had began to learn the ways of the people of the lands in which they had begun to enter. That after coming out of Egypt, after their wanderness in the wilderness, then they entered into the promised land. They encountered people that had particular ways. And the Psalm 106 is a decry about how they had learned their ways. Let me just let you look at beginning at verse 34. They did not destroy the peoples concerning whom the Lord had commanded them, but they mingled with the Gentiles. They learned their works. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters to demons, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. Reading on in verse 39, it says, thus they were defiled by their own works. They played the harlot by their own deeds. Therefore the wrath of God, or the wrath of the Lord, was kindled against his people, so that he abhorred his own inheritance. We have sacrificed our innocent ones on the altar of convenience. Now, I understand all of the arguments and all of the debates and the exceptions that people want to present about rape or incest, but the bottom line is, folks, that almost the number one form of birth control since 1973 has become abortion. That when an inconvenient birth takes place, there is a means to get out of it. I need you to understand something. How did we get to this? Well, it's very simple. If you look at what's called the pyramid of behavior, beliefs and values and practices, you find that beliefs shape our values. What you believe shapes what you value, and what you value shapes your practice. Like an iceberg, only our practices are seen, but they are the result of our values and our beliefs. If we do not believe that God is the author of life, we will not value life. And if we do not value life, we can excuse the taking of that life. And it's not just the unborn. It's the inconvenient. And it's getting to the point of even the elderly in some cases. Statistically, you've heard this because we had the March for Life just Friday, the 49th anniversary. But since Roe versus Wade, You saw on the screen that 61 million, well, that was a 2020 figure. The figure now is closer to 63, somewhere between 62 and 64 million abortions have taken place in America. Last Friday, thousands marched on what was the 49th anniversary of the decision to legalize abortion. And I listened to some of it in preparation, and it is called the March for Life, and prayerfully it will be, as many of them said, the last one held before that decision could possibly be overturned. You are probably aware that today, Roe v. Wade is being reconsidered by the U.S. Supreme Court, and a decision is pending. It will probably come out this spring that would place the practice of abortion back into the hands of the states. But I think it's time we call it what it is. We keep using the word abortion because it seems ambiguous. But when I was with you this past December and we talked about the times of Jesus' birth, and we talked about that place where the wise men did not return to Herod, and he went through the land and he killed the children 2 years and younger, there's a name for that. It's called infanticide. Why? Because he killed the children. What do we call what we're doing now? I have and I want to give you a heads up right now. I have a video clip, but it is not something that you should be concerned about. It's not graphic by any means. You're not going to see things you don't want to see. You're going to hear something that is going to surprise you. And in fact, the host of the video clip is going to invite you to just close your eyes. It may be more of what you hear than what you see, and it's called The Sound of Abortion. This was taken by Peter Heck 11 years ago. And so what you're about to experience is 11 years old and would normally last a lot longer than what you're going to hear. You've seen the reality of abortion in America. Now hear it.
I just want you to, right there in your seats, just shut your eyes. What you're about to hear are the sounds of metal BBs striking the side of a tin can. For every BB that strikes, it represents 10,000 lives lost in the wars of America's past. 10,000 lives for every BB. This is the reality of what is occurring in your country. The American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean conflict, the conflict in Vietnam, September 11th and the War on Terror. Since 1973, the War on the Unborn Child. God help us.
If you're like me, at some point during that, something inside you was saying, make it stop. I don't want to hear anymore. I don't want to hear that many BBs. And each BB represented 10,000 lives. That's the reality that we're dealing with in this country and what has happened since 1970, 49 years ago. Going back to Psalm 103, or 106, it says, many times he delivered them, but they rebelled in their counsel. They decided what they thought was best for themselves. and their decisions and their counsel became that which they were using that came in a rebellion against God. And so they were brought low for their iniquity. What is the counsel today? Well, it's changed over the years. If you've been following this subject, you know that for a long time, the big question was about when does life begin? And then it went from being pro-life versus pro-abortion from pro-life to pro-choice, as though the word choice was going to somehow make this a cleaner, more sanitary discussion and an easier preference. And the idea was put forth that a woman has the right to choose what to do with her own body, and that was the basis of the discussion. But saying abortion is a right of choice is like saying I have the right to choose not to get a speeding ticket, especially in Gibson. But you and I know that the time to make that choice is not after they've pulled you over. The time to make that choice is not when the lines appear on the test. By that time, the choice has already been made. And what we need to come to understand is that the biggest argument that has come about since then has been the question, well, when does life begin? I mean, are we really even talking about a baby? And they tried to use terms like tissue. I almost brought a box of Kleenexes up here and so I could say, no, this is a tissue. This has no potential for life. But everything else that takes place in the mother's womb has a potential for life that we cannot deny. You look through the Bible is very clear as to when life begins. You look at the story of Jacob and Esau in Genesis chapter 25, and you hear the Lord saying to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. But 2 nations are already present in your womb. Not just 2 babies, not just 2 fetuses, 2 nations. Why? Because the potential of what is going to happen from these 2 children is going to grow into nations. We have no idea a life that is taken, what impact and what future that life would have had upon this world. We may very well have aborted in the last 49 years the one with the cure to cancer, or a president that could bring us out of all of this stuff. We have no idea but what the future would have held. When David was contemplating his own existence, and you can look at this, Psalm 139 is one of the best psalms to look at in its entirety on the sanctity of human life, because of all the psalms, this is the one that David makes perfectly clear when he says, you formed my inward parts. You covered me. Where? In my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. He goes on to say, your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed. We're going to look in just a moment. We're going to see how that life is formed. But David says, your eyes saw me even before they were formed. And in your book they were written. All the days were fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Isaiah the prophet recognized that he had been formed from his mother's womb. And thus says the Lord your Redeemer, and he who formed you from the womb. I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself. I made the comment about this back in the Christmas season. I don't know if any of you caught on it or not. But do you know who the first person was to recognize the incarnate Christ who had entered into this world, had left heaven's realms, and had come into this world? While yet still in the womb of his mother Mary, John the Baptist, an unborn child. Elizabeth said, as soon as the voice of your greeting sounded in my ears, the babe leaped in my womb for joy. Tell me there is not life there. Tell me there is not purpose there. Tell me there is not future there in the womb. Paul the Apostle saw himself called to be Paul the Apostle from the womb. When he said in Galatians 1:15, when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through His grace to reveal His Son in me that I might preach Him among the Gentiles. These are just some of the biblical examples that you can find that talks about how life begins in the womb. That's not a question. Science is starting to catch up. If you've been listening to some of the other political things, you've noticed that there has now been introduced what's called the heartbeat bill. Do you know why? Because a baby's heartbeat can be heard after 18 days from conception. The heartbeat of a child after 18 days can be heard. And that's why the heartbeat bill says once that heart starts beating, you're dealing with a living being. In 56 days or 8 weeks, all the organs function while still in the womb. 1 week later, 9 weeks, the baby has individual fingerprints. Talk about individuality is now present, and that baby has fingerprints. 1 week after that, 10 weeks, a baby can feel pain. Now, do you realize that most abortions used to be conducted within the first 20 weeks? Well, after the first 10 weeks, the baby can feel it. Somehow along the way, we've just closed our ears to these, as one film years ago put out, the silent cry. That the infant in the womb was feeling the pain of its own abortion. After 12 weeks, moms, you get your sonograms and your ultrasounds, you can see a baby smile. After just 12 weeks. Tell me that isn't life. And when we see this, the development, and this is science, this isn't even the Bible, this is the science that's telling us these things. We need to realize that there is a purpose in what's going on in that womb. I've heard it said that the egg of the bald eagle is more protected than the child in the womb. What makes human life so sacred? What makes it distinctive and different from even the bald eagle and how we have protected its egg? What makes human life so sacred? Well, there's only one answer, folks. It's Creator. Because our beliefs shape our values. If you don't believe that God is the Creator, then you don't believe or value that that which is in the womb was created by Him and belongs to Him. The Bible is perfectly clear. We were created in His image. When you read the book of Genesis, you find there in the very first chapter, God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. And by the way, I'm giving a little spoiler here. Come next week, because the message next week is simply, He made them male and female. And we're going to touch on that topic as well. I told you I'm going to be hitting some of the hot topics. Well, welcome. I don't like to say I don't know how long I've got, but I'm going to take as much use of the opportunities that I have. But another thing that is facing our society today is this confusion over what it means to be male or female. It's in the news. If you've been watching the swim teams, it's in the news. And we're going to look at it because God created him male and female, and He made them both, male and female, in His image, after His likeness. We are created in His image, but He didn't stop there. He continued to work on us. We are His work. We are His workmanship. I love the fact that in Ephesians chapter 2, after those verses in 8 and 9, where it says, by grace you've been saved through faith and not a result of works, lest any man should boast. It then says in verse 10, for we are his workmanship. I love that word, because the Greek word for workmanship is poema, poem. I love being called God's poem. I'm a creation as a poet myself, and I'll go ahead and warn you, I plan to end this message with a poem. But as a poet myself, I know that what it takes to create an image, to create a story, to create a thought, and then to have to manipulate the language and to move this here and move that there so that this rhymes, or that the meter is in place, or that there is enough syllables. Well, God is making a poem out of your life. And if I may use the expression, he's making an opus out of your life. A magnificent poem out of your life. And he's working together all the things that are coming into your life to make that his opus. We are created in Christ Jesus for good works. And when did he start this? He started it beforehand, before we were even formed, that we should walk in them. I said that he's working all these things together. We use this verse from Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. That after we are here, he starts working in our lives to create that image of his Son, Jesus Christ. And Bill Gaither in his kids album, he's still working on me. Some of us remember that, don't we? It's true still. He's still working on you. He's still working on me. And he's working all things together so that it is God who is working in us. He's been working from the beginning, from the time of our womb, all the way through to the moment where you're sitting this morning. God who works in you both to will. You've heard me share this before. This is my biblical definition of grace. Philippians 2:13. For it is God who works in you to will. That's desire. So many times Christians don't act like Christians when they're not hanging around other Christians because they just simply don't want to. God says, I can change your want to. I can build in you a desire. And part of his work on us is to give us desires that are his desires, and then to accomplish his will by working through us, he gives us not only the to will, but the to do, the ability for his good pleasure. The two things that we lack most. I don't act like a Christian because I don't want to, or I don't act like a Christian because I've tried and I can't do it. Well, you're right, you can't do it. But he can. And he does it by working in you, giving you the will and the to-do of his good pleasure. But I think the last thing that I can say to you this morning about why all human life is sacred is not just that we are created in his image, not because we are his workmanship, that he's working on us specifically by name. Something that I look forward to sharing to you in February around what is commonly Valentine's Day. We talk about the day of love. I want you to recognize that you are God's greatest love. And you are his treasure. Peter put it this way, you're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own. That expression, special people, King James I think says peculiar people. I always liked that because I could have an excuse for being peculiar. But that word peculiar or special means treasure. We are his treasured people. For the purpose that we may proclaim the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Why is abortion wrong? It's not just political. It's not just moral. It certainly is not just economical. It is spiritual. Because you and I are spiritual beings that God created in His image. And He wants to work through our lives to make us His special poem. And He loves us with a love that is unsearchable. We think that sometimes we have the right to take in our hands the right to give life or take life. Paul made this statement in Romans chapter 14. None of us lives to himself. No one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. We need to remind ourselves that whether we live or die, we are the Lord's, and that goes for the one that you've created. Sometimes I have to remind my children, you got to provide for what you produce. And yeah, it's hard. But you know what? It's worth it. It's absolutely worth it. And to be honest, it really isn't your choice. There is an old sermon illustration that I worked into a poem. I told you I was going to close with a poem. Here it is. This poem is about a young boy who tries to fool an older wise man in the village by presenting him with what he thinks is a no-win scenario. It's simply called the choice. Listen carefully. To confound the wise, the boy decides to put him to a test, to devise a plan to show the man which of them is best. For wisdom is strong to not be wrong. The boy is confident to form a condition without a solution becomes his one intent. So taking a bird, without a word, he cups it within his hands. He alone can claim and know the same what pressure the bird can stand. Then tempting the wise to now surmise, to answer to his call, the man must decide, does the bird inside his hands even live at all? Should the wise to guess and answer yes, he'll crush the tiny frame. Then lessen his force, produce the corpse to dispute the wise man's claim. Should he answer no, it's a simple show, just to open up his hands. The bird will fly, the crowd will sigh. The wise won't understand. Either way it goes, the boy now knows, the wise man now must lose. But to the boy's surprise, the man closed his eyes and he said, the life is as you choose. We have a choice. Death or life. And our nation has chosen death for far too long. Would you pray with me that God would stop this?